So with that, let's talk about deployment. Let's talk about one specific scenario where a customer actually deploys an Azure Managed Application. And before we get into this, it's a little more complex than our standard stuff that we've been doing with, simple data storage. This one is a real example. I just want to point that out, that this was created in support of a project that we worked on here at Microsoft. So let's take a look. Firstly, we start off in the publisher subscription. This is where we're going to deploy certain assets. One of the things that the publisher has, I should note, what this is I should have explained what this application does. What this application does is allow a publisher to sell raw data. So instead of bits, instead of an application through the Azure Marketplace, they're selling data. It could be demographic data, whatever the case may be. Okay, so we start off in the publisher subscription, and they've got a set of Azure Data Storage accounts into which they have put all of their raw data. And that data may be ticking over at a very fast rate, right? It might be stock ticker data. That stuff's moving all the time, perhaps. All right, so they've published that. And the next thing they do, you saw earlier, we deployed a data share service. This is the same service that we're talking about here. There is a separate resource group on the publisher side into which we create a data share service. In that data share service, we create what we call data shares, which are constituted by data sets. Data sets are entities that point back at data in the raw data resource group. And we have a collection of those, and we call them a data share. Now we have a magic association, if you will, to Azure Marketplace plans. And here's what I mean by that. We have an offer, one with a single plan, one with two plans. And note we have 3 data shares on the left-hand side, and we associate those with a given plan. So if you're buying offer 1, plan 1, you might be getting customer behavior demographics for shoppers, something like that. That happens to be a real data set. If you are buying offer 2, plan 2, that may be a very different data set with different data in it. Now, what happens after I make that purchase, or I should say when I make that purchase? We've talked all this time about how it moves resources into the customer subscription. So let's have a look at that. Here, what happens is that ARM template associated with that plan creates a data share service instance, and it creates a share subscription, which is nothing more than an entity that says, I'm going to receive data from share 1, and I'm going to put it into my share snapshot data source. Notice on the right, I have my Azure Managed Application. And so you saw earlier that I put customer and data allowed actions into a Partner Center field on the Technical Configuration tab. I was giving permission for that data share service to talk to that share snapshot. That's exactly what that was. And I was giving permission to the customer to look at the data share service and at the share snapshot. And that, as I said, came from a very real example. So when people buy these plans, we do it again, and again, and again, and again, and again. And that's what this particular architecture looked like. See, there's a question. Is somebody answering that, or I'll jump over and have a look?
Yeah, I'm looking at it. No, don't worry. It's a ASP question. So
okay, great.
It takes time. Yeah.
Alrighty, we'll keep moving along here. So that has been an interesting architecture for folks to have a look at, and thought I would share it with you. Oh. I'm going to back up one. I missed the magic secret sauce because it happened on the left. All right, so in this state where we deployed our data share service and our subscription and our data share, our data storage account for our snapshot, remember that webhook that we saw in Partner Center. So in Partner Center, I can, on the technical configuration tab, specify a webhook that's going to be called after the entire application has been deployed into the customer subscription. So it won't fire until then. But notice on the left-hand side, bottom left, we have a webhook Azure function. So we wrote a function, an Azure function, and specified it as the webhook. The job of that function was to go over on the right-hand side to the share subscription and say, okay, start synchronizing this data. That was its job. And it had to do a lot of machinations to do that, but the point is that we've got a webhook here who's doing real work after the deployment to coordinate the publisher and the consumer side of the house. And that's a good example of what we might use a webhook for. All right, so there we go. Let's move on past that. Oh, we've already seen the technical configuration here because I walked through it. So I'll let that go. Here's an example of that notification endpoint URL that we saw on the technical configuration page. And one thing I'll note is that when you receive that message on your webhook, you reply with a 200 or something else, but anything other than a 200 will cause that webhook call to be retried. So the AMA runtime, if you will call that webhook for 24 hours. Now, it doesn't do it incessantly, it doesn't do it every second, but it will wait in between calls and it'll keep calling for 24 hours before it times out. Okay. So what's going on here? Customer provisions in Azure Managed Application. It's done. The webhook is called with a status. That is to say, what is the status of the deployment? And it could be that it was successful. It could be that it was that it failed. And we'll take a look at the payloads in just a minute. The webhook returns a 200. We're good to go. Everything's fine. What if it happens a little differently? So the Azure Managed Application resources deploy. Great. And now the webhook is called with a status, and the webhook returns 200. This is meant to show an error, pardon me, so that it replies back and the webhook is going to do that retry, say with a 403. This is an example of a message that a webhook will get when it's called. And notice here, this is one place that you pay attention to very carefully in these webhooks. So we look at the provisioning state. This is the provisioning state of the Azure Managed Application and the resources associated with it. If we get a succeeded, then we're good to go. What we would like to have happen is we would like that webhook to return as quickly as possible and have as little logic in it as possible, because it tends to be somewhat fragile, if you will, and we don't want a long-running process there. So what you might consider doing is taking this payload, dropping it into a queue, or even if it's a bigger thing, well, dropping it into a queue is probably good enough. We don't need something like Event Grid, because how often are people making provisioning your application? How often are they making purchases? Right? It's probably not that frequently. So dropping it into a queue or something of that nature, dropping it into a database, then eventing off of that, that's a nice model for handling these payloads. And here's just a little bit different example. And note here that we failed deployment, so you can take action on that, like notifying your customer that that their deployment failed. They would have seen that, but you can send them an email or something like that to follow up with that customer, so that you can figure out what's going on, figure out a way to make it right. All right. And of course, you get the a nice detailed error message down here, like the one that was pasted into chat earlier, and you had to read really closely to decipher. That's neither here nor there. All right. So the webhook can take these events in, or event types, I should say. And this is a table that just is showing us that these are the operations, puts, patch, deletes, and we can see the states that we might receive. All right, so we talked about succeeded, we talked about failed. Accepted is going to fire first. It fires before anything else happens with the managed deployment or the Azure Managed Application deployment. And then we'll get a succeeded or failed. All right. When someone deletes their Azure Managed Application, you will get a deleting and a deleted, or you can get a failed to delete. And so again, this gives you an opportunity to take some sort of remediating action if you would like to reach out to your customer. Hey, saw you delete our application, wondering if there's a way we get your business back, whatever the case may be. All right,